thank you for joining us for Teach for Bangladesh's webinar series EdTalks. My name is Maimuna Ahmad. I'm the founder of Teach for Bangladesh, and I'm really pleased to have you with us along with this incredible panel that we have for you. At TFB, we really believe that for effective education reform, it requires an ecosystem approach, that we need an alignment between multiple actors, starting with students and parents and teachers, including entrepreneurs, policymakers, development partners, the media. We all have to come together around what is really needed for the children of our country. And we try to embody that approach in our own work. Our EdTalk series is, along with that effort, trying to bring together different stakeholders who have an interest in education to have an honest and robust discussion about the real challenges that are facing our children and our education system, and to discover together possible solutions. Last month, we hosted the first in our EdTalk series, and potentially maybe the first webinar actually in Bangladesh on the impact of the coronavirus on the education system. We had a wonderful discussion with colleagues from BRAC IED, CAMPI, DFID, and the DG of the Directorate of Primary Education. Today, we have another wonderful panel lined up for you, and I will take a moment to introduce them in just a minute. But I wanted to first just thank everyone who's joining us online through our Zoom webcast, as well as through Facebook live streaming. I want to invite you to take a moment and introduce yourself. You can use the chat function, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook, and tell us who you are, what your name is, what your profession is, what is the organization that you're affiliated with, and you can put that in the chat. We are expecting a wide range of education professionals with us today, from consummate professionals who have been working in education their careers, their entire careers, to fresh teachers and participants in the TFB program who are teaching in schools right now. And so we're really looking forward to having this be an interactive discussion and getting questions directly from all of you to our panelists who are here today. I will start and frame the discussion, and then we'll really try to get as many questions from you all as possible to our speakers. So throughout the conversation, please feel free to type your questions into the chat box if you're in Facebook. Or if you're on Zoom, you can actually write your questions using the Q&A feature. And so without further ado, let's get started. As we all know, schools have been closed in Bangladesh for about 2 months. We heard just recently that they will remain closed at least until June 15th, which of course means that there's a possibility of schools opening up sometime as soon as 2 weeks from now. With students nationwide experiencing a significant loss in learning, ultimately we know that this crisis impacts the most marginalized and most vulnerable children disproportionately. The World Bank introduced us to this term of learning poverty a couple of years ago, and this issue is likely to be exacerbated, and children will be further behind academically by the time it is safe for schools to reopen. And so the situation that we find ourselves in threatens to undo one of the biggest successes that Bangladesh has had in education around enrollment. So in today's panel, we will explore these issues as well as others that face us as we look at the prospect of children returning to learning formal and non-formal schooling. So we have with us some esteemed panelists, TM Asaduzzaman from the World Bank, Katelyn Runyan-Gless from the World Food Program, and Iqbal Hossain from UNICEF. There are longer bios for our panelists that are posted on the chat box that you can check out, but I'll take a moment to give you a brief overview of who's joining us today. So we're really pleased to have Asad Bhai with us. Asad Bhai is an education specialist from the World Bank Education Unit in South Asia. He is leading research and policy work in education and in ICT, a very pertinent topic for the world of education and COVID. He's the chair of the Development Partners Consortium in Secondary Education, and an alum of the University of London and Oxford Brookes University. So welcome, Asad Bhai. We have with us also Katelyn Runyan-Gless, who is the Program Policy Officer of School Feeding at the World Food Programme. Her team has supported the development of national school feeding policy and is supporting the phased rollout of fresh, hot-cooked school meals for 17 million children in government public schools. We look forward to understanding more about where that program currently stands and what we can expect in days to come. Katelyn also has the distinction of being an alum of Teach for Bangladesh staff, and worked with us as the head of our teacher training and leadership development team in 2014 through 16. We have with us Iqbal Bhai, who is the education specialist at UNICEF, where he is coordinating UNICEF's remote learning initiative with the government and other partners in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Iqbal Bhai maintains the secondary education and skills for adolescent and youth portfolio at UNICEF. He's working with the ministry on developing a national transferable framework for soft skills, a unified curriculum from pre-primary education to grade 2. He's working on e-learning, project-based learning, etc., and is a graduate of Kolkata University and BRAC University. So thank you all very, very much for making time to join our discussion today. Let me start with you, Iqbal Bhai. Given the work that I know you are doing and UNICEF is doing with other development partners to address the current loss of learning that's occurring, and as well as preparing for a potential increase in dropout. Tell us more about the initiatives that the UNICEF is taking when it comes to non-formal education and supporting children who are in the danger of coming out of formal schooling.
Okay, thank you, Maimuna. Thanks for inviting me in this panel, and I'm going directly to the discussion and topics. Yes, as one of the key technical partner to the government for especially the COVID response in education, from the very beginning, UNICEF is actually supporting the initiative of government, both the ministry like Ministry of Education and Ministry of Primary and Mass Education, to provide support the remote learning initiative that started with the television telecasting the classroom, and then gradually came up with different multiple platforms. So from the very beginning, actually, the discussion, the way we were trying to provide our support to the government is actually increasing the reach and also the interactivity from the remote learning initiative. As you have seen that within 1 week, actually, government responded the crisis and came up with the live class initiative through Parliament television, and quickly then primary, madrasa, and technical education. But at the same time, we were providing coordination and technical support, and we were working together with the government and other partners to bring all the partners together to ensure like how we can ensure the maximum reach of this remote learning initiative, so that like we know that the most marginalized groups are actually lies with the non-formal education program, and even in the formal program, big groups are there who are at risk. They are at risk for different reasons, so they can be dropped out from the system. So it is we need to increase our effort to ensure that we can reach the most marginalized with remote learnings, to keep them in education, and also to ensure them their interest, their continuities are maintained. So from that point of view, yes, this COVID issues actually has a greatest impact on the access of education, especially the retention of education, in two ways. One, from the formal education system, a big portion, the anticipated number, somebody saying is 20%, 30%, who are at risk from the formal education system to be dropped out because of this situation. This is one area. On the other hand, like there are a quick survey by Campaign saying that 2.7 million non-formal education students are there in this country, run by 115 NGOs. So they are already dropped out and came up with different alternative modalities in education. So they are in even more risk to be dropped out. So these issues is really a highest concern from our side, from government side, and I'm sure from all of our other side, because mostly we are going with online education or technology-based education. So what we did actually, in one way, we are working with the formal education system to make it more interactive, like to include like mobile-based learning, then radio-based learning, and even when possible, introduce a learning package for the most marginalized children who cannot be reached by television or internet platform. So that effort started from the very beginning, because you know that the mobile reach is more than 95%, whereas the television reach is around 15%, 50%. On the other hand, we can use the radio also, because mobile phone can also be used as a radio if we can mobilize that properly. So from the very beginning, we started to use the multiple channels to increase the reach in formal education system that is going on with the ministry and A2I. At the same time, we initiated work with the Bangladesh non-formal Bureau of Non-Formal Education in Bangladesh to came up with a strategy for non-formal education students. And you will be happy to know that we mobilized more than 27 partners who are directly working with the non-formal education to came up together and then to do the exercise by different groups to came up with a strategy how we can quickly connect our students from the non-formal education system and gradually can make them on board and ensure the continuity of education, and at the same time, like formal education, how we can come up with a reopening guideline for learning centers, and gradually what are the areas that we need to really provide our support from the government side for ensuring the continuity of education through the non-formal education system. And you'll be happy to know that the draft strategy paper is already been developed, and we are very closely working with the non-formal education bureau and along with other partners to initiate some of the national initiative. And you'll be happy to know that in the national response plan also for COVID, National Education Response Plan, non-formal education is already included as part of like program to be responded. So these are the two big areas that we are trying to reach the most marginalized groups, so that we can address the digital divide, so-called digital divide that we are saying when we are going through the online education. But again, here I'm saying that the strategy is there. Many organizations have already initiated mobile-based learning for those groups that also came up as a quick response for the non-formal education, and also coming up with series of activities as a short-term plan, mid-term plan, and long-term plan. Maybe future, if we can get more time, then I can explain some of the intervention, like how we are working with non-formal education bureau to address some of the crises through the that our non-formal students are facing. So I can stop at this moment, maybe then will come later.
Yeah, sure. Iqbal, thank you so much for that overview. It's really helpful to understand. And I definitely want to commend UNICEF and the government for really taking quick action, and especially bringing together multiple organizations to this collaborative space. I think that's one of the things that I've been most inspired by, is the type of collaboration that I'm seeing in the sector that really is I think, not that there wasn't collaboration before, but there's a new spirit of collaboration, exactly, I would say. Exactly. So that's really fantastic to see. I'm curious though, as you said, you know, we have these limited methods to reach kids, phone, you know, internet, television, you know, and I love hearing that you are also doing packets and kind of offline materials as well to supplement that. But nonetheless, access for the most marginalized students is still going to be limited, right? Does UNICEF or the government have an estimation of how far back students are falling the longer this crisis continues? What are we losing in terms of learning?
Yeah, like for formal education, it's easy to say that this number of classes you are losing and the gap, and according to the plan, like lesson plan, you can estimate a bit. But for non-formal education, there are varieties of interventions. So it's sometimes when we are talking about non-formal primary education, even there are different type of models, like an accelerated model, sometimes multi-grade, multi-level model, cohort type of model with different duration. Though for the non-formal primary education, the curriculum is national curriculum, but still the delivery mechanism, the timing is different. So actually, and then there are other alternative modalities, skills program and other non-formal and informal education and skills program have different interventions. So for non-formal education, it's very difficult to say at this moment that for which intervention, what is the overall loss. But here, the major point that I want to make here is actually the discontinuation, the risk of discontinuation of learning is really big. That as they are already out of this formal education system, so with different approach, so there is already an acceleration, there is already an additional effort, an alternative method to bring them back into education, and different modalities are going there. So this is one thing. On the other hand, in terms of participation, mostly the students are from the most marginalized families and vulnerable groups. So their livelihood issues are also in threat. So considering all of that, keeping them in learning is one of the biggest challenges at this moment. So addressing those is an issue, and the way it is discussed in the working group also, that maybe we need to address initially to reconnect them, the students, so that they are in learning and their motivation is going on and parents are all motivated. And the second is actually to make them all the materials available to them, so that with minimum instruction they can continue learning. So we need more time, because we have already proposed a survey to come up with identifying the issues, like what are the major area of learning issues, what are the curriculum issues, learning loss for each of the interventions, and how we can do that, as the diversity is an issue in the non-formal education system. So we have already proposed a study to understand that gap by model, by interventions. But so far, as the model implemented by different organizations that's the uniqueness of the non-formal education. That it's not maintaining one single curriculum. So mostly by implementing agencies, they can really come up with those analyses that where their learners are, because as I said, there are cohort approach and there are multi-grade, multi-level approach. So
Right.
they have all those analyses. So at this moment, we are coming up with more generic strategies to address those issues, but gradually we will address the issue of learning loss by intervention, because we have already proposed a study to identify that.
Right. I think it's so important to have these studies to actually analyze the problem before we start proposing solutions, so that we can actually match it to the data. That's really great. Thank you. Iqbal had brought up these points around that to have students continue learning, they have to be motivated to come back to school. Parents have to be motivated to send their children to school. Katelyn, if I can turn to you and our guest star, Amalia. What role do you see as school feeding and other social services that the school might provide? What role does that play in bringing kids back to school and keeping kids in school?
We're not super happy at the moment. I think, school feeding was originally designed as, a food security intervention, But what the World Food Program has found across the globe is that it's really, really a wonderful tool to get kiddos into schools and to stay in schools. And that's one thing that we've seen here in Bangladesh, is that in the districts where we implement school feeding with the government, and mainly the government owns that program and implements it themselves now, we do see a large increase in student enrollment and retention. So we're hoping, and as the government moves from biscuits to school meals, which they have been doing, and they've done that gradually in about 16 sub-districts. What we're hoping is that we see an even larger increase in retention. But I think the other piece is that we have started with this coronavirus pandemic and the closure of schools, working with the government to do take-home rations. Yeah. So we've been distributing about 50 biscuits to students, and in 2 specific sub-districts in Bangladesh, Uki and Kutubdia, which are in Cox's Bazar, we run a special program called Magavandol, where we also do literacy stuff. And in that program area, we have been doing a little bit about what Iqbal is talking about, saying, okay, Room to Read works there with us as our cooperating partner. And so they've been working to develop additional materials to give to kiddos, because as we know, it's hard to get kids to read when you've got them sitting in front of you in a classroom. It's even harder when you're trying to do it in, I believe the TV lessons are 20 minutes, and I believe they're actually only for kiddos in grades 3 through 5, perhaps, not even for the youngest kiddos. Not that we want kids in front of screens for prolonged time, but what are we doing for those kids? It's just really hard. And so, we're trying to think creatively about how we can be part of the solution, even though it's not really our mandate. But we are very, very hopeful that as schools come back into operating in person, that the school meals and the school feeding, which is the biscuits, will be a real incentive to bring kiddos back. And that's originally why it was started in 2001 in response to some floods in the north, to bring kids into school. And what we've seen from the data is that in the Ebola crisis, we had a lot of kiddos who left school from the crisis. They never came back. They became, especially our girls, they became pregnant. They weren't welcomed back into schools. And I think for me, that's a big concern in Bangladesh, given our already really high child marriage rate. So I think we just need to be extra cautious, thinking about how are our schools serving as a social safety net, and how do we build a holistic childhood for our kids? That's not just do they learn to read, but are they able to live the lives that they dream for themselves, which is more than just being able to read books, but being able to kind of take the path that they would like. And I think hopefully school meals is part of enabling kids to do that by getting back into school. And I think that's where the World Food Program is trying to figure out how do we work best with other partners who have, a comparative advantage in other areas that we don't, to ensure our programming is as effective as possible for kids. So I'll leave that there.
Yeah. No, thanks. Thanks for that. That's great. And we can dig into. You've raised a number of really important issues, and we can dig into that deeper later in the conversation. You've talked about the disproportionate challenges facing girls, how schools are actually the data and the kind of track record of school feeding has shown a correlation to like getting kids to come to school, to stay in school, and how that really was one of the initial motivators for even starting the program. So I think this is great, and we can dig into this further. But first, Asad, let me come to you. And you are leading the consortium on secondary education. I'd love to hear a little bit from you around how school closures and the COVID pandemic is particularly impacting secondary students, because I understand there's a bit of a difference in access and the digital divide between primary and secondary. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what the World Bank is currently doing, both at the secondary level, and if you are able to speak to what's happening at the primary level as well, that would be great to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maimuna and Teach for Bangladesh for having me here today. So at the outset, I think what the World Bank is doing at a global level is that we have a jointly framework for reopening schools, which was kind of designed with in collaboration with UNESCO, UNICEF, and the WFP, and which was shared with our client countries. And the policy dialogue on this continues. The framework is actually designed to be a flexible tool that can be adapted to each context and updated as the situation changes. So that's one part. And then on the country context, the World Bank is closely having dialogue and giving technical assistance to the government of Bangladesh, both in primary and secondary education subsector, to help the government design an emergency education response plan, so that we are quite prepared to tackle the current pandemic situation which the country is facing. Now, to be precise, in secondary education, we kind of received a proposal from the government to support this current initiative that the government has taken, that is TV broadcasting and e-learning, online education. And the funding requested was around 7 million USD. And then what we're trying to do is we're trying to restructure our existing SCDP program and incorporate that request accordingly. Now, on the primary level, the World Bank is also having a current dialogue with the government to see if we can have some grant support through our GPE funding in particular to address the education needs that has arisen due to the COVID pandemic situation. So that part is still something that's still at the designing stage. Now, as you rightly mentioned, at the secondary level, the situation is slightly different because of the age group, definitely, and of course, some of the problems that was also highlighted by Katelyn and our colleague from UNICEF, that the dropout rate in secondary is quite high. And also, when it comes to the disparity of learning, the disparity of access within that, within the secondary grades, it's also something to really address. Now, what I also feel that at the secondary level, it's quite important to make sure that when schools reopen, in particular, there needs to be a lot of thinking on how we design our process and whether we need a standard operating procedures as schools reopen. I mean, we might need this community transmission or this virus may not be fully eliminated in the next couple of months. Let's be honest with that. I mean, that's something we can quite safely say. But if we are to open schools, we need to prepare our school management, our school climate, so that we are able to address this situation in a very systematic manner, and the school management should know that what are the steps they need to do when there is a emergency situation. And also, I think it's also important at the secondary level that we need to also make sure that when it comes to reducing the dropout or reducing the early marriage, and also reducing disparity among learning. So there are a couple of things we need to ensure in order to make sure that these things, the sector is protected. For example, we need to continue paying our stipends We need to continue paying the teacher salary. We need to continue the school meal program once the school reopens. So this kind of initiative, it's quite important, as we move towards school reopening. And I think, these are things that are already there. And also one more thing I also want to mention, that this current situation has taught us something which, we all kind of realize now, that, many countries were not prepared for this situation. And the way it hit us, it's making us realize that, the concept of e-learning, it's something that can be really, really looked into, and we really need to, make good use of that concept. And I think post-COVID, there should be a lot of focus, on this. And therefore, at least in Bangladesh secondary education, what we are planning to do is to institutionalize the current initiative that the government is taking through some, at least under SCDP, there is current dialogue to see how, even after the schools reopen, or once we go to the normal new world, how we can make sure that we have a we mainstream the current e-learning initiative taken by the government under the government's regular program under secondary education. So I'll stop here for now. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great, Asad Bhai. Again, you've raised some really great points. Let's dig into one of them a little bit deeper. You talked about reopening schools and what it would take to prepare for reopening schools and open them safely. In Western countries, we're seeing countries start to move towards reopening schools with dramatically fewer students in the classroom, with safety protocols put in place to protect both teachers and learners. I'm curious, in the context of Bangladesh, what are reasonable and realistic interventions that can be put in place to protect educators and students? How long do you think it would take for us to actually be prepared to reopen schools in a safe way, keeping in mind that at least in cities like Dhaka and Chittagong, there are often 80, 100, 120 students sometimes in some of the classrooms where we work, and simply not enough classrooms and not enough teachers to make those class sizes any smaller. So I'm curious, in our context, and this is really a question that's open to the whole panel, anyone can take it. What do you think are the core challenges to reopening, and what is a realistic timeline within which we can be prepared to welcome students back safely into school?
Thank you. I think this is a very important question. I'll take the easy one first. When, I don't know. I wish I could answer that, but I'll try my best. I'll try my best to give my ballpark judgment. I think part of it is also a judgment call, because we know that there are researchers, there are global leaders saying that we won't. Vaccine is the only answer to the problem, but then we don't know when the vaccine will come out. So that's one of the bigger challenge that we are currently facing. But then education has to continue some way or the other. We are into a learning poverty. The country is also facing a learning loss due to several factors of students, and we want to make sure that we kind of move ahead on the great work that the government has done to improve the overall access of students, to also improve the overall education quality, and so forth and so on. But I guess once countries, if you look at countries who have opened schools, they have actually first tried to control the community transmission. So that's one. And also they have put in some standard operating procedures, they have had policies, and they have had really well-designed implementation procedures. So these are kind of like the prerequisites for opening schools. And I think in Bangladesh's context also, these are things we need to follow. I think there was there was, I think the current the school closure will continue officially until June 15th. But if you ask my honest opinion, I think, because we're like just 2 weeks behind that, we probably need to watch the situation a bit more. And when I come to the challenges part, right? So you'll probably understand the reason why, we really need to be very cautious in Bangladesh's context. So I think, when time comes, I think it's something that it's one of the decision. I don't think so it should be predetermined. I think it should be something like, you read the situation, you understand it, and then when you see that the situation has changed, then you give that call. So, we really need to make sure that we don't run into a risk of, forcing ourselves into a situation where this pandemic situation could lead to something else. So that's one. And the second one is on the challenges. I think, you talked about the digital divide, in your previous, question. And we all know that, this digital divide, it could be among students, it could be among teachers, because, when it comes to technology, not everybody learns at the same level using tech. Not everybody is accustomed to using tech. So on that sense, I think one of the challenges we will face is we need a lot of investment on teacher professional development. At least we need to gear up our teachers to be accustomed to the new way of pedagogy and education service delivery. So that's one. And the second is, I think we also need to make sure that I think when it comes to this school closure for good, I'm sure there are a lot of talks about it currently. But I think in Bangladesh's context, I think private schools are at most risk when it comes to school closure. As we all know that, there has been also some global, noise on this, that these are the, kind of schools which is quite in the front line when it comes to closing. And then, we have a huge portion of our students going to private schools. And the third challenge,
at the secondary level.
At the secondary level, exactly, at the secondary level. And also, these concepts of social distancing. And, so to implement these in Bangladesh, so every country may not face the same challenge. In Bangladesh, our teacher-student ratio is quite high compared to the regional or global average. Some of our classrooms are quite overcrowded.
Yeah.
So therefore, this kind of, puts us into a position where we need to implement social distancing when we reopen schools. But how do we do it? It's something, we need experts to advise us. But I think one thing I can clearly see is, I think, every space in a school premises will need to be used when we reopen schools, because,
Sure.
when we have social distancing, we need to make sure that, we use all our resources. And then,
Right.
when it comes to social distancing and also this tackling the post-COVID school climate, I think we also need to talk a bit about our water, sanitation, and hygiene management system to mitigate the risk.
Yeah.
That, so I think these are, some of the challenges. And last but not the least, actually, we talk a lot about these school funding, right? So I think we are in a pandemic situation and we need more resources to implement these theories and ideas that we just talked about. And I think here the private sector could play an important role. So we know that our public resources are not enough, right? So it needs to be subsidized. And I think that's something we really need to think about. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Asad Bhai. So what I'm hearing from you is that, Iqbal Bhai, I'm going to come to you right now.
Yes.
What I'm hearing from Asad Bhai is that there is a plethora of different challenges we need expertise to figure out how to actually reopen schools in a way that is safe. Bangladesh has certain contextual challenges, and I'm hearing from you some doubt around whether or not we can actually successfully implement and roll all of that out in a 2-week window. Iqbal Bhai, you've been smiling as Asad Bhai was talking. Tell us what you're thinking.
Just I want to add with Asad Bhai that, you know, mostly when we plan something for the future, especially even in emergency situation, always a mindset is an issue. Because if you want to keep everything same and want to, like, you know, address the challenge with different activities, I think that will not work in these situations. Like, you have to mold the targets, you have to, you know, break down all the issues as challenges properly, and then come up, like, we cannot avoid the learning achievement of the children. Like, you know, you can take a decision that, okay, whether schools are open or not, we will take an exam in December and we'll start a new academic year from January. You can take those decisions. You can take decision, okay, there will be auto promotion and we will arrange a public exam or something like that for that group, but others will auto promotion. So this type of initiative will not help. Superficially, you can see that there are a lot of issues, but it will not help. So my point here is, like, we need to think very practically in the post-COVID situation, considering all of the issues that Asad Bhai mentions, especially about school reopening, like safe reopening, then learning, then focus most marginalized, the inclusivity, and also the protection and well-being issues. So if we consider all of that, then definitely you will not be able to achieve the target that you have set in pre-COVID situation. So you have to negotiate. You have to negotiate with that. And you have to negotiate with time. You have to negotiate with the technological issues and others. And then you can only develop something achievable, practical, keeping all those quality issues in front if you are open, flexible to take it. Like a single loss, you can cover this loss even in 3 years. So definitely the expert will come up with more thing, but my understanding here is, like, to be open and be flexible to solve the issue considering the country context, rather keeping that as okay, in pre-COVID situation we have a target and we have to achieve that, and for that we have to do anything. So that will not work in this situation. And in long run, definitely the redefining education and everything. So big agendas are also coming. So we need to also align with those agendas, that how we can fit with that. And this COVID situation gave up many big lesson learning to us. Like, you know, our data gap is really now, we are suffering for that. We don't have enough data. We don't have student tracking mechanism. We cannot, you know, we don't have proper disaggregated data and information to come up with targeted interventions. We don't actually have very good base or very good foundation for use of technology. So all these things need to be critically reviewed, and accordingly children should be at the center. Their learning achievement should be at the center, and accordingly we should plan.
So what I'm hearing from you is that we need to be realistic. We need to understand that this is a, you know, really unprecedented situation, and that the targets that we had before may not make sense right now. And so we have to adjust and be flexible. Of course, that's 100% true. And we know that as with everything in this pandemic, that inequities are just getting more exacerbated. So that's inequity both in our country, but also on a global level, right? So where Bangladesh was and where other countries who were more advanced in education, where that gap is also going to continue to increase. Exactly. And you know, no matter actually what we do, and the question is, how do we minimize that? Katelyn, how are you doing? Are you good to take a question?
I think so. We'll see.
Okay, cool. I mean, so we've been talking about this prospect of reopening schools and what it would take to do so safely and appropriately for kids. You know, I think one of the big challenges that all teachers in Bangladesh faced even before the pandemic is that teachers have to address many levels of learning inside a classroom, right? So we have students, large class sizes, and a variety of abilities, a variety of competencies that kids are coming in with. And you have a teacher who has a limited amount of time, limited amount of resources within which to meet those needs. When the kids are coming back to school, if these disparities are further exacerbated, what is it that we need to do for teachers to help upskill them, right? Such that they're really able to support children in the post-pandemic world?
I mean, I think this actually kind of goes along with what Iqbal is saying. I think on a larger scale is, you know, I don't think it's a good idea to expect teachers to be superheroes, you know? I think we need a larger system, and this is, sorry, Mateo's here to take the baby now.
Hi.
So I think we need to figure out, you know, these are the skills that we expect teachers to have, but also this is the type of ecosystem that we expect them to operate in that's going to enable students to achieve success. I think also what's important to recognize is, of course, we need students to be able to read, and of course we need them to be able to read increasingly complex texts, and we need them to be able to think critically about these texts that they're engaging with. And I think if you can do that, then you're enabling kids to access the science material and access, you know, the mathematics material, right? So this reading is really the foundation. But I think another important aspect is, are we equipping our teachers with the skills and time with kiddos to be able to provide students with these tools, right? Because reading is essentially one of the tools that kids have to make sense of their world. But another tool that kids need is around like their social emotional growth and learning about, you know, who they are and do they feel safe. You know, if you're a kiddo who is, you know, I know Dhaka and I know Cox's Bazar. I don't know the schools outside of these two areas very well in a personal sense. But if you're a kiddo on Kutubdia Island, which is off the coast of Cox's Bazar, and a lot of the water there is saline, and you know, you may not even have good access to water. But if what you're hearing is that, you know, the COVID-19 is super dangerous and you have to stay away from, you know, everybody, you have to, you know, keep distance and you have to wash your hands. Well, what if you're a kid who doesn't have access to water to wash their hands regularly? What if you're a kid who has access to water but no soap? How then are you feeling about living in the midst of a pandemic, right? So there's both of these aspects around, yes, we have to give kiddos the skills, but we also need to make sure that they feel like they are safe and well cared for. And that's a larger community, I think, undertaking, right? It can't just be mom and dad that say you're okay. It can't just be teacher that says you're okay, right? And I think this is where we need to reconsider and rethink about what does it mean to provide kids with a holistic package that enables them to succeed. Because that's going to mean and look different depending on where kids are, because they're going to need different sets of stuff, right? And so if you've got in Dhaka City potentially, and you're in maybe an area like Mirpur, your teacher might be able to focus a lot more on academics because you've got access to a bunch of other community resources. But if you're a kiddo in, you know, Kutubdia, you might really need a lot of social emotional support because your body is producing a biological response where your cortisol levels are elevated. Your body is experiencing trauma. You can't take in new information if you're absolutely terrified that, you know, you're going to get sick or your mom and dad is going to get sick. And if one of them gets sick and already one of them's out of work, you know, you recognize that your family is going to starve. So I think there's a lot that's going on here to figure out what do we really need to do within schools, but also within the community to give kiddos whatever it is they need to be able to succeed. And I think that within Bangladesh, my personal experience is that we're not really sure how to give kids that stuff at scale in a way that really enables them to reach the highest levels of success. right? We see small pockets here and there, but at scale, how do we get kids to be able to fully achieve whatever it is they want to do? So that's my.
Yeah, I think that's so on point. And I think both what I hear in what you're saying, Katelyn, and what Iqbal has shared, it's kind of this question of prioritization, right? Like, what is most important for kids right now, and how do we really focus on what kids most need at different levels, and really aligned to the context that they're in. And I heard you underscore this importance both of foundational literacy, so that children have the ability to access content, whether that's in school or even on their own, and this really critical socio-emotional piece. And I wonder if you and other panelists would go so far as to say, when schools reopen, there's a real possibility that schools may be open for just a short period of time before we have to go into another kind of lockdown situation, partial or complete. So if schools are open for a limited window of time, does that window of time need to look different? And do we need to shift our priorities and focus on a few core things during that window to make sure that kids are really well prepared for what might come afterwards? Katelyn, and then Iqbal, I see you nodding as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, go Katelyn first. Yeah, please, Katelyn.
Yes, I do, and I think it's gonna be community by community. Where you have communities that are hard hit by the coronavirus, you might see that they need something different. In a community that hasn't been hit, you may be able to get back to academics rather quickly. But I think it's super important that and I'm a diehard reading and literacy, like that's my jam. But first and foremost is to make sure that our kiddos feel safe and loved, and that they feel like there is some level of like stability or control. And so processing what has happened, I think, is going to be super crucial. And it's something that probably, you have to remember, in Bangladesh, we have like the lowest amount of contact hours, I think, globally. Like our kiddos are just not in school. They're not. And when they're at school, they don't necessarily have access to things that would enable them to process trauma, right? We don't have school counselors. We don't have, PE where kids can run out some of their maybe anxiety and aggression, right? So there needs to be, I think, this lens when we look at kiddos and think, first, are you okay? Are you in a space where you can take in new information? If you're not, what am I gonna do to help you get there? And then of course there is this foundational piece of, I would say, literacy, thinking, okay, if we can't hit all this missed math stuff, we can't hit all this missed science stuff, how do we do hardcore literacy, probably geared toward phonics and some comprehension? And I would say for math, think about, base 10, base 10, base 10. And that's where I would prioritize between now and the end of the year if schools are reopening.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. So, yeah, again, here, I want to actually add is, we need to think differently again. So the way we define our contact hour earlier, maybe we need to redefine the contact hour now. So contact hour is not just hour like the teachers are giving the learning, or in a school or classroom when teachers and students are contacting. Rather, it can be transformed into a learning hour. And we can introduce alternative mode of pedagogy like problem-based learning and project-based learning, where teacher, with minimum instruction from the teacher, a learner can start the self-paced learning or personalized learning with the support of peers, with the support of other family members, siblings. So this type of alternative modalities and pedagogy should be introduced, as Maimuna, you have mentioned, that if we are coming up with a small window time, and then again, the possibility is there. So how we can utilize those time. So if we plan accordingly the way we are planning before the post-COVID, then we will miss this window of opportunity. To me, like we need to connecting the dot. Like from education, it is difficult to provide all the services, including livelihood initiate services to the student to keep a non-formal student into education. But you see, there are a lot of social safety net program is going on, but it is not properly connected with the education. Maybe the same family is receiving or tagged with different type of social safety net programming, but we are not connecting all those so that like these are, we can maximize the impact of social safety net program and at the same time education program. So this is one area. And another area is like, as I mentioned, in education terminology, we need to come up with redefining the contact hour. Home-based learning, blended approach is not always mentioning that face-to-face learning or online learning. Blended approach can also be like teacher instructed into the school and then learning at home. So without even online intervention. So minimizing the school time among the students, then more instruction and connection with teachers and do more work at home. This type of alternative pedagogy, problem-based pedagogy, project-based learning. So those can be introduced. So I think this is a reality now, and we have to go in the direction gradually, which will not only minimize the risk, but also ensure the competency-based learning that we are trying to promote. So that I want to add here.
Thank you. And I hear some echoes of in what you said around actually Katelyn's earlier point around holistic support to children, right? This idea of connecting the dots and making sure that it's a holistic package of support that kids are getting. I want to go to some of the questions that have been coming in from Facebook and from our Zoom participants. Mohammed Masoom Billah Khan, who's the training coordinator of Second Chance Education PDP4 at BNFE, has a burning question, he says. And Masoom Billah Bhai says, are the students, teachers, and guardians ready to deal with the digital devices and content as a basic mode of content delivery? And you know, maybe Asad Bhai, we can start with you, since we were talking about you know, the digital divide, the innovations that are coming right now through technology, and how we can continue to leverage technology once schools reopen. You know, how ready are our students and teachers, and what do we need to do to support them to both develop the skills as well as the mindsets needed to effectively utilize technology, right? Technology is just a tool. It's only as good as it is, you know, used. And so how do we help our educators be able to effectively use these tools?
Thank you. Yeah, I think thank you for the question. You know, one part is that, look, every crisis also creates an opportunity. And here, I think, you know, as we had also mentioned before, you know, we have a great opportunity to actually, you know, take a big step at the bigger concept of e-learning, right? So I think, you know, our colleague from BNFE had rightly said that I think, you know, Bangladesh has done a lot of investments when it comes to ICT in education. You know, I think across the school education sector, I think most schools by now should have laptops, multimedia. Some schools have a digital library, or you know, digital classrooms. There have been different projects which have supported these initiatives. So now what next, right? So the next part, or the next target for us, is to use ICT for education, right? So as pedagogy, or as, you know, our regular using it for education service delivery. So this is somewhere, this is where, you know, we really need to have the focus in the next short to medium term. Now, the need for this was there. It was always there. We all know it, right? But now that need has accelerated. It's knocking on our door. You know, we really need to, you know, think about how to do it. I think, you know, I've also already mentioned that, you know, there needs to be a lot of teacher professional development now, which will also focus on ICT. Schools need to now really use these ICT gadgets. You know, it shouldn't be parked somewhere at the school premises, but rather, you know, school should, you know, make sure that the students are quite accustomed, you know, to learn through these ICT equipments. And then the other thing is also, you know, one part I really think that it's time for us to focus that, we need a lot of collaboration for sure. I think we can't move along, and education can't move along. So here, I think the Ministry of Primary and Mass Education, including BNFE, and also Ministry of Education need to have strong collaboration with ICT Ministry and see, because they are also the expertise, they have also some good resources. And we need to also make sure that our future initiative in Bangladesh, be it new project, be it new activities in an existing project, it should for sure address the new world that we are moving into post-COVID. So I think with these few words, actually one more point I also would like to mention. I think if most of us realize that because of also let me also talk a little bit about the economic crisis that the world is also facing, and Bangladesh is no less prone to it. So parents may have a tendency to invest less in education as we move forward, as schools reopen, right? So, then these concepts of e-learning, and, distance learning and students, like what Iqbal Bhai had also said, becomes really, really an important solution, because then a kid can still continue to learn, staying at home. Although that's not the ideal situation we want. We want the kid to come to school and get the formal education. So I think these are things that the government, development partners, ministries beyond MOE and MOPMI should really focus and collaborate in the future. Thank you.
Let me ask you another follow-up question to that, Asad Bhai. Barring the question of access, right? If we're talking about the kids who actually do have access to technology, what are the limitations of that tech in promoting student learning, and what adjustments do schools and teachers need to do in order to actually get use out of the technology? Are there limitations, and what would we do to overcome them?
Yes, I think one of the things I really like what Katelyn had also mentioned, that this TV and radio broadcasting program, right? It serves education needs of a certain age group. I mean, for example, think about the pre-primary kids from the pre-primary education, right? So it's very hard for us to, use tech to reach that part, or maybe even in the early primary grades, right? So that's one of the bigger challenge. That's one of the limitation. That particular age group or the grades. So that's one part. And I think the other challenge is also because, we know that, Bangladesh has done extremely well when it comes to connectivity through internet, through digital devices, through televisions and so forth and so on. But still, the official figures say that the access issue on television in Bangladesh, especially in hard to reach areas or areas that are in a disadvantaged situation, is something which kind of needs to be something that we really need to also look at. And then, of course, and that also contributes to the concepts of digital divide that I had mentioned, that there is an obvious disparity on that, because because not all geographic areas in Bangladesh have an equal technology advantage. So that's the second. And finally, I think when it comes to also learning through tech, so we really need to prepare our students in a way that if schools reopen, inshallah someday, and we also need to have plan B, like you had said, that school may again, go, or school may also may be locked again in future. So it may open in a staggered and in a phased manner, right? So the first lockdown, nobody was prepared because it suddenly happened. The virus just escalated and it went out of our control, right? So, and governments globally, were forced to take decisions, and therefore schools didn't have the planning time. This time they will get some space to plan ahead for the second lockdown if we have one. So I guess here, I think, we we really need to have a very good strategic plan within the school management and our students and our teachers, who are the most one of the most important when it comes to supervising a student's education. So just to make sure that in future, if we face this kind of similar situation, we have a solid plan B in place. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question that has come from our audience, this comes from a Teach for Bangladesh fellow who is teaching in Chittagong, Jahidul Islam. Jahidul Islam asks, as many countries are going to face financial vulnerabilities, how are the development agencies thinking about supporting education financing after school reopening? And today we have 3 education specialists who are working in different multilateral organizations. And maybe each of you could speak briefly from your own institutions. What changes do you see, if any, already to education funding? And what do you anticipate will we see in the months and years to come? Maybe let's start with Asad Bhai again, and then we can go to Iqbal Bhai and Katelyn.
Thanks. I think, like I said, this is a very nice. What was the name of your colleague from Teach? Zahid. Right?
Jahidul Islam. Yes.
Zahidul Islam. Okay, great. So as you know that the education investment in Bangladesh comprises of 2.4% of the GDP, right? And then for obvious reasons we have already discussed in this session, we know that the appetite for investment has to go up. So that's clear, no doubt about it. And I think at least from the World Bank's perspective, we have a emergency response window which we are exploring. We have some global funding that's applicable, that will be utilized by all countries. But in Bangladesh's context, I think when it comes to specifically the education sector, I'd already mentioned that we will be supporting a large chunk of our support through our funding in PDP3 and PDP4 and SCDP. And also we have a GP grant that we are still discussing to address the COVID issue. But despite that, I think we also have IDA 19 that will not only cater to education but all sectors in Bangladesh, and I'm sure projects which will have which will be effective under IDA 19 in different ministries and sectors. I think there will be some encouragement and incentive to see how the COVID issue overall could be addressed. And then finally, also, I think when it comes to funding, here we are at a situation where I think our resources, as I had already mentioned, is not enough. I mean, we know by now, and we need to make good opportunity. We need to have our resources very well coordinated, so there is minimum wastage. There is there's no duplication of effort between the development partners, and there these coordination issue of coordination comes very well. And then also finally the private sector and the NGOs and the other agencies. I think here they also need to play an important role, because as we know that our goals may not be achieved with the public resources we have, and here I think we really need to bring them on board and see how we can make maximum use of our resources. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, the way we actually looking into this like the funding issues, UNICEF has been working for long to increase the public financing in education. So we have one of our advocacy agenda, like 20 by 2020. That means 20% of budget for by 2020. So we were working with government for long with this advocacy. So being a technical agency for education, we always think that comparing to the other neighboring country, even our public investment in education is actually comparatively less. So we need to focus on that, how we can do that, especially when we were moving towards the middle income country. So the dynamics of development funding has been changed. So from that point of view, So this is one of our ongoing agenda, and I'm sure the change context will also expedite the process. So this is one thing that we are working closely. The second point I want to mention on that, like definitely the ecosystem, funding ecosystem will change and will have an impact of because of COVID. But I think focusing more on being a technical agency, focusing more on effectiveness of programming and maximizing the existing investment, result from the existing investment should be another area of focus, so that like we can maximize whatever we are investing in education system, and accordingly we can see that the financing gap can also be reduced in that manner. And we are more focusing on, again, also the corporate financing, private funding opportunities. And that also another area, especially when we are thinking of more education in technology in education and other options. So that is also coming as a big area for us to mobilize, to facilitate, to advocate with. So I think, yes, like as Asad Bhai mentioned about the dynamics, but from the technical point of view, so I'm sure that from UNICEF side, the advocacies around these areas will be more, so that we can minimize the finance gap, and we can like increase the effectiveness of education programming that we are implementing at this moment. But our focus will be definitely on increasing public financing for education.
And by the way, Iqbal bhai, before we go to Katelyn, you said that UNICEF's goal is to help countries achieve 20% spending of budget on education by 2020. Where is Bangladesh in that now?
At this moment, around 14% actually is Bangladesh is
Great.
spending in education. But yeah, this is an ongoing advocacy, and depending, sometimes, you know, there are other calculations also. Sometimes, you know, when the overall size of the budget increase, then the total
Right.
amount of money increase, but the percentages are not increasing in that.
Right.
So that dynamics also there, but altogether is 14%, but target is 20
of
by
budget.
20. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Katelyn.
We do similar stuff to what UNICEF does in terms of advocating for the government to allocate funding toward the school feeding program. And we're currently working with them to write their DPP, which is how they allocate funding through the development budget. The school feeding program has not moved to the revenue budget as of yet. So I think for me, I'll keep that answer short since we're not super ed focused, but that's how we advocate funding for the meal program. And globally, of course, UNESCO, UNICEF, WFP, we all work on a bigger, Iqbal, you might know the name of it. There's a big pot of money, a couple billion that they're trying to get together, that they're putting in a central pot, and then it's going out to the aid agencies, and that will probably be a somewhat slower process than we would like, but there is a global effort through all the UN agencies to get a couple billion for the Corona COVID-19 response.
Great. I'm going to try to squeeze in a couple more audience questions in the remaining time that we have. We have a question from Muhammad Hanif Ali from the Dhaka Sania mission. And Katelyn, you might be a good person to address this. As you know, that there's no scope to use internet, mobile, and mobile access to television in Rohingya camps. What is a good way for distance education in the context of the Rohingya camps?
Yeah, so the camps are tough. There's a lot of challenges that we face in the camps that we don't face in the host community. I'm not sure if this gentleman is part of the education sector in Cox's Bazar. There's I think it's UNICEF and SAVE really work on kind of leading that sector down there. I don't know what they've formally decided, but they have been doing a lot of work and a lot of consultations and collaborations about how they can move forward. Iqbal, I don't know if you have more on that, what's going on in the camp, but yes, those are real challenges. And I know that within the food distribution and the e-voucher shops that we run down in Cox's, we have managed to institute social distancing mechanisms to enable folks to still access their rations, and we've doubled up on rations so that folks are only coming once a month rather than twice a month. And so I think there is probably scope to collaborate in that sense, that, you know, if we move to extra materials for kids, they could get it, they could pick it up when they pick up their food, you know. But I think that getting folks back into schools anytime soon is in the camps is exceptionally challenging, because we don't have the facilities. We don't have the facilities that we would like to be able to treat folks in the camps if the virus becomes widespread through community transmission. And that's something that WFP globally has been working on, is getting PPE and building the logistics kind of that are needed in order to pre-position the requirements to hopefully be able to stem the tide of transmission should it really come to the camps in force. So that's kind of how we work on it. And WFP does all of the logistics globally for, you know, humanitarian like flights and getting things in and out. I know our executive director the other day was saying that at the moment we are like the largest airline operating globally because everyone else is shut down, and we're, you know, we've got hundreds of flights every month bringing stuff, pre-positioning stuff, getting things into countries that need it. So that's how we operate. But specifically what will happen in the learning centers and the camps, that's a really good question that I can't give you a definitive answer on.
Iqbal, do you want to weigh in on that?
Actually, I am not, you know, part of that team that they're working, but so far I know that it's very difficult. Agree on that. And yeah, the sector together with all the partners and sectors is trying to work out the approach and negotiating with the administration to how to do that. But so far I don't have any new information on that, so I cannot.
Sure, thank you. So as all of you know, Teach for Bangladesh is a leadership development program, and you know, we really believe, again, that for there to be sustainable, effective change in education in Bangladesh, that there has to be a change in the leadership within the ecosystem of education. I'm curious to hear from each of you, actually. What do you think this current crisis in education demands of leadership at various levels inside the education sector? What kind of leadership do we need to see from teachers and head teachers, from, you know, school administration officials, TEOs and UEOs? What do we need to see from policymakers, from the development sector? Maybe you can each pick one or two of those actors, and I'm curious to get your perspective. What shifts in leadership do we need to see? Asad bhai, maybe we can start with you.
Okay, thanks. So I'll pick the school leader, the school principal. Is that fine?
Yes,
okay,
please.
Great. So I think, you know, here, you know, when it comes to a totally different school climate that we will operate into, I mean, post-COVID, or even when schools open in a staggered manner, I think here the school principal will have an important role to play, set examples for his teachers, for the parents, you know, and also maintain close collaboration and liaison with the district education office and the Upazila education office. I think that's quite important. So here, I think the level of vigilance from school principals will have to go up, because the margin of error that is tolerable is zero. Because, you know, one wrong step, you know, and then, you know, the entire, given the contagiousness nature of the virus, you know, it can really, you know, lead to a disastrous situation. So here, I think the level of vigilance needs to be super high from the school leader's perspective. That's one. And I think when it also comes to school leadership, I think, now the school leaders really need to activate different committees that schools have, to come together and, have good plans within the school. For example, the Parents Teachers Association or the school management committees, or even, the school leaders may need to, I don't know, I mean, I'm just guessing, may need to form a new committee to combat COVID. I mean, what happens if, a student gets infected, God forbid? Who does the student go to? Uh, School leaders may also need to have one dedicated focal point among the teachers or someone who the student or the management may reach out to in case there is an emergency situation. So we don't want people to run around, right? So these kind of strategic decisions a school leader definitely needs to think about as we think about opening schools. And also I think the other part that a school leader should definitely have an important role to play is the community, how to mobilize the community, how to raise awareness. Because as I had mentioned, now, because of the economic crisis, which has also resulted from the pandemic situation, parents may not be willing to send their kids to school. So here, I think, school principals are usually regarded as very well respected within the community, at least in the Bangladesh's context, right? So here, I think there needs to be a lot of counseling and awareness, with the parents to make sure that, the schools are, sent back, the students are sent back to the schools. And of course, last but not the least, I think when it comes to school reopening, we'll have one more issue. I think that's obvious, on the mental health of students, right? So here, I think it's not only, we talk a lot about the mental health of the students in a school climate, but I guess we quite often miss out the teachers, the parents, their mental health, right? So, and as I had said, the school principal is regarded as a very well respected person within the community. I think here we probably have an important role to play when it comes to also counseling as teachers and parents. So maybe I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fantastic point. And if I may, I would share a short story that I just heard about recently that I found really uplifting. There's a school that we work with, a government primary school that we work with in Badda, that we've worked with since 2014. And the head teacher there, a wonderful woman named Shanazapa, is just a beautiful example of what you just described, Asaduzzaman. And she's been working, I've learned, not just to mobilize the community around her to keep children at home and safe and learning. She's also identified who are the families that are in the greatest food insecurity in the community. She's gone to local shopkeepers, given them lists of names of those families, and said that for these families, you must not charge them for any basic necessities, rice, lentils, oil, whatever the basics are, they should be keeping ledgers, and that she will personally look into how that expense is covered after the fact. But right now that they are under instruction from her as a leader in the community to make sure that these families are being fed. And I just thought it was such a beautiful example of what it looks like for a school leader to really step up and take responsibility for their community safety and use that respect and position that they have to protect the vulnerable inside of their community. So I couldn't agree with you more. Iqbal bhai, Katelyn, let's start with you. Iqbal bhai, what kind of leadership do we need to see from the education sector?
Yeah, I think Asad bhai and you covered very good. Let's pick the example that you have given, like the Shahnazapa example. So whether our system is facilitating to build up this type of leadership, actually not. So if you are seeing that the way we are running the program is mostly, very centralized, coming from the top, and then even the leadership is conceptualized in a different way. If you can do all the listed activity as guided by the top authority, then you are the good leader. So that means like it's not you're a good implementer, but you're a good leader also. So from the conceptual, I want to focus on that conceptualization of leadership, the way we are doing. So the example that you have given, we are raising this example as a good example, but the system is not actually preparing our teacher to be leader like that. So that's the gap. So my point here to mention is that as COVID situation is actually bringing a lot of changes and out of box thinking for us, both in the system, from the parents' point of view, from the policymakers' point of view. So maybe we need to focus more on decentralization of many things, so that as per disaggregation, our leaders, the teacher should be the best leader at the community. So they should take their decision properly. And there, all those core skills need to be nurtured, need to be facilitated, so that teachers, the principals, the local or subnational level education officials can take that type of lead, and it should be awarded, it should be facilitated, so that like you can really manage this type of pandemic, or not only this pandemic, the education in emergency in Bangladesh or in many other country is coming up as a very cosmetic type of terminology, but not internalized by the system properly yet. So then, and leadership is the only way. You cannot, like, any emergency will not hit equally all part of the country and all institutes. So definitely it has different impact on different location, different institution. So the leader who are the frontliner, they should understand that, and they should be prepared like that, so that they can have that capacity and courage to respond quickly, being a leader of the school and leader of the community. So that part need to be facilitated strongly. Otherwise, mechanical leadership will not be able to do. And we can only say that, okay, one example here and one example there, but all will not come together.
Beautifully articulated, Iqbal Bhai. And I wish we could keep talking about this for another hour. We're almost at the close. Katelyn, some closing thoughts from you on this question.
Yeah, I think for me, this goes back to what are our systems of social protection, and are they adaptive enough, and are they shock responsive enough? And I think what we've seen is that they're not. So for instance, we have the primary school stipend program. It should be, and it could be very easy that instead of families getting, 100 taka a month or whatever it is these days for one kiddo, and maybe I think 120 if they have two or whatnot, in a pandemic that we're in right now, if the government and the system itself was more adaptable, you could up that to a cash injection of 1,500, 2,000 taka, like that, like that, right? For school feeding and school meals, you can immediately switch to take-home rations. What we know is that when you move from giving kids food in school to giving them take-home rations, that food becomes shared with the household. So often what you want to do is you want to double the ration. If we had, if that was built into the blueprint of our social protection schemes, we could immediately do that. And that's what you see in some other countries that are handling the crisis in different ways. So they've been able to do this more easily. And I think it's something that I know UNDP, the World Food Program, and others have been exploring, the World Bank have been exploring that here in Bangladesh about, there are a couple of different ways and terminology to think about how do you take a social protection scheme or a safety net, and how do you enable it to expand and adapt to meet the needs of different groups. So there's like horizontal expansions where you're increasing the number of folks who are eligible, right? So instead of just primary kiddos, you extend it to secondary kiddos as well. And then there's also vertical expansions where instead of just being, 100 taka, it's 1,000 taka, right? So I think that for me is at the top levels of policymaking and leadership. How do we recognize that not just in Bangladesh, of course, but across the globe, our social protection mechanisms are not strong enough to really deal with these heavy shocks, and we need to figure out how do we ensure that they are in the future so that we're not getting into the system, right? Like in the US, for example, you know, how do we say like, okay, you know, all of these basic services in the medical establishments are now free to anybody who needs a walk-in service, right? Because in the US, we have really high, prohibitively high costs for healthcare. So you might be sick, or you might think you have the coronavirus, but you're not going to go get tested because you need to go to work, because you need your paycheck, because you need to feed your kids, right? So we want to think about how do we become more adaptable to ensure that we're not relying just on extraordinary leadership on the individual level, but that we really have a stronger ecosystem where kids and communities get what they need outside of, you know, a superhero.
Thanks. Thank you all so much. This has been such an incredible conversation. I feel like we've covered so much ground in a short amount of time. You know, I'll try to articulate a couple of the themes that I've heard come up. I think the thing that I'm really taking away is the need to be context specific, flexible, and adapting to what are the immediate needs. How do we prioritize what each community, each school needs right now, and really sequence that, right? I think, you know, we had a really fascinating conversation about if schools are open for a short period of time, what do we prioritize? How do we make sure that socio-emotional learning, the safety of children, their mental health is given first priority? Because we know that when children are in a state of extended stress and trauma, that learning will not happen. How do we prioritize foundational numeracy and literacy so that children have the tools, the skills, and the resources to be able to drive their own learning? We've talked about how do we not only work to close the digital divide, but leverage technology once schools reopen to ensure that both children and teachers are more effective in their learning. We've talked about the importance of protecting funding for education, knowing that this is just the start of the crisis. And even though there might be a temptation to divert funding away from education, that we do that at the peril of our students, because schools aren't just a place of learning, they're also a place of social safety for students and for communities. And finally, we talked about this importance of leadership really being encouraged and brought into the system. I loved what you said, Iqbal, right? That it's not enough to have these outlying examples of leadership, but we really have to think about what is the system doing to encourage and scale up that leadership? How is that's something that, you know, how do we make leadership the norm and not the, you know, outstanding example? Yeah, I mean, I think that this is incredible. We really appreciate it. And we really appreciate the time that you all have taken to share your perspectives and your expertise. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's joined us online, virtually on Facebook and on Zoom. We will be posting the recording of this call and some notes from this call soon for people to review, and those who weren't able to join us to be able to access. We're planning a really special next episode of TFB EdTalks. We've talked a lot about teacher and school leadership today, but something that I've found missing from a lot of the education webinars I've gone to is actually hearing from those stakeholders directly. And so we're hoping to actually convene a webinar where we're able to bring teachers, head teachers, TEOs, and others to share their experiences of this pandemic. And so we hope you'll all join us for that really special discussion. And the last thing I'll say before we close is that Teach for Bangladesh is really excited to have you know, launched our own digital learning initiative. We're contributing to the initiative from A2I and the government to produce high quality learning content on EduHub. We've also developed our own YouTube channel, so please check it out. I think the link is given in the chat so that you can see some of the really interesting content that our fellows and alumni are developing for students, and soon also for parents and teachers. So look out for that and follow us along for our updates. Thank you all again. Have a great night and looking forward to continuing our partnership.